Walt Disney's death in December of 1966 would change the company forever. It would struggle to progress forward, but that doesn't mean that the company and its different divisions ever stopped. The theme parks, the animation department, the live-action filmmakers all continued chugging along, even if it was a challenge to do so. I find myself with a similar challenge. Wait, hold on. What are we doing?
Those are like a ton of work to do. I've got to watch all the movies, and then there's all the different notes I have to take and research. So much goes into those.
Give the people what they want, what they demand.
I've been tasked with something daunting. How do I even begin to explain Disney's live-action film era after Walt's death and all the way up into the 1980s? Plus, the stress that YouTube has put me under is really wreaking havoc. I decided to get away. I rented a cabin in the woods to write and clear my head, to try and make sense of everything and focus. I'm paring down dozens of films, down to a select few that tell a cohesive story, and one that represents the uncertainty of possibly Disney's strangest batch of films. So, my name's Josh Taylor, this is Modern Mouse, and today we'll be discussing Disney's live-action Dark Age. You might be familiar with the Bronze Era of Disney animation, or more commonly known as their Dark Age. Movies like The Aristocats or The Rescuers were made quickly with little budget, and movies like The Black Cauldron, which clearly took a much darker tone than many were used to from a family-friendly company. The live-action Dark Age is somewhat similar. Films were made quickly, cheaply, and as time went on, the films became darker in tone to try to appeal to an audience that believed Disney just made kids stuff. As we go on, it'll become clear how lost the company was without Walt Disney at the helm, steering further away from the company's vision of all-ages entertainment. But before we dive into all of the films of the era, let's talk about what Disney leadership looked like during the Disney Dark Age, because I think it adds a bit more context. See, during Walt's years, Disney was like a little kid with endless dreams of adventure and fantasy worlds, and boundless imagination. He was a very creative person, and he was pushing the boundaries of what could be done in animation and making the kinds of classics that would endure the collective conscious nearly a century later. And when Walt died, a good amount of that magic and creativity went away with him. The Disney Dark Age isn't necessarily all bad, but I think it's telling that just about every movie in this era is overshadowed by the absolute wealth of the childhood-defining hits that came out immediately before and after this era. So, after Walt passed, his older brother, Roy O. Disney, ushered in the awkward teen years. Roy had actually been the co-founder of Walt Disney Productions, and he had been Disney's first CEO starting back in 1929. Walt was the creative half, while Roy mostly handled the financials. He was on the verge of retirement when Walt died, and he put it off a bit longer to handle the company. And his biggest project that he oversaw was the completion of Walt Disney World, which Walt started. When the park was opened in 1971, Roy was finally able to retire, but unfortunately died 2 months later, which is just about the best push for me to find a way to retire earlier than in my 70s, but that's beside the point. Don Tatum came next as the first non-family member to take the reins of the company. He'd been a long-time Disney senior executive before stepping into that role, and Card Walker was the president of the company at the same time that Tatum was CEO. And Card Walker would become CEO after Tatum, so a lot of their accomplishments kind of overlap. Like Roy, their biggest accomplishments were at the theme parks. They helped open hotels at the Walt Disney World Resort, Epcot Center, and opened Tokyo Disneyland. Before Walker left, he also founded the Disney Channel in 1982. Eventually, the channel would become a place for a lot of great original content, but It was mostly a mediocre HBO knockoff with just Disney movies when it started. So you can thank Walker for making a janky, not amazing thing that went on to be actually a pretty decent and popular thing. What I'm saying is that Walker's Disney Channel is like the not-so-great Mean Girls self-help book that went on to inspire the actually amazing Mean Girls movie with Lindsay Lohan. That comparison might be a bit of a stretch, but it's okay with me because I'll find any reason to talk about Mean Girls because I'm a real keen fan of Lindsay Lohan. Hey, that rhymed. Finishing out the Dark Age was Ron Miller in 1983. He was actually Walt's son-in-law and really unpopular as CEO. There was a straight-up Save Disney campaign led in order to get him removed from the CEO position. So he was only around for about a year. Did he punch Mickey Mouse, or was the 100-acre wood burned to the ground on his watch? Why did Disney need saving from this guy? I think that's another story for another time, but all in all, even in his short tenure, he did help create the Touchstone label, which created more adult-facing movies without messing with the family-friendly branding that Disney had established, something I'll come back to later in this video. After Miller, Michael Eisner would come in and lead the Disney Renaissance.
Hello, I'm Michael Eisner, head of the Walt Disney Company.
But the main takeaway from this era of Disney leadership is that while these guys weren't the creative visionaries that Walt was, they were able to build the things that would help pave the way for the future of the company. That history of Disney leadership helps explain what was happening behind the scenes at Disney. But what impact did that have on the creative side? We've talked about the animated movies of this era before, but now it's time to dive into the live-action films of the Dark Age.
Opting to fall back on the surefire bet of family comedies had done well for The Love Bug, which was the second highest grossing film of 1969, so Disney decided to keep doing that, including another 1969 film, The Computer Wore Tennis Shoes.
Starring teen studio star Kurt Russell as student Dexter Riley, as well as his rival Cesar Romero, better known for playing the Joker on the Batman TV show. Some might say he's the best Joker. I mean, just look at him.
Hello, kiddies. Meet the Joker. No hard feelings.
Lovebug star and comedian Joe Flynn also star in the film. It's fun to visit a film about computers in 1969, as they take up so much room and are so different from the type of computers that we see today. If a child came up and talked to me right now about how a giant room-sized computer actually worked, I wouldn't even know where to begin. But the computer really isn't the point of the film. The point is that Kurt Russell has a freak accident and ends up becoming as smart as a computer.
Film critic Leonard Maltin would call this the first of many carbon copy films out of Disney during this era, and I couldn't agree more.
Add to that this film would end up having 2 sequels, all featuring Russell, Romero, and Flynn returning, each with a different freak accident premise. Both Russell and Flynn would star in another film just a few years later, 1971's The Barefoot Executive. Once again piggybacking off of what had worked before with Disney comedies, this movie relied on the comedy of a chimpanzee becoming a TV executive due to his ability to know when a show would be a hit or not. I do think that it's interesting to note that The Computer Wore Tennis Shoes and The Barefoot Executive were both directed by Robert Butler, best known in Hollywood for directing a ton of different pilot episodes of TV shows. He worked on Batman, Superman, Star Trek, and Mission Impossible, so he was no slouch. I think when looking at these films, though, both the directing and acting aren't really the issues weighing them down. With multiple films a year coming out and no Walt Disney guiding the studio staff, movies like The Barefoot Executive were one-joke films stretched really thin. And they kept to minimal budgets that only featured studio talent. They were just repetitive and ultimately unrecognizable from one to the next. Similar things can be said for 1971's The $1 Million Duck. It featured the Lovebugs Dean Jones and Joe Flynn. Critic Gene Siskel walked out on this film, only one of 3 that he did that to.
I mean, that's a chemically mixed up duck. It's even been radiated, and we're not eating those eggs.
None of these films were really memorable, and are simply rehashing the comedy and writing of previous films with much better plots, in my opinion.
Wait, what were the other 2 movies that Siskel walked out of?
I don't know, probably some really bad movies from the 90s, like that third Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, like where they were Japanese samurai for some reason.
Yeah, or one of his like Mac and Me.
The Flintstones 2?
Yeah, that was a rough one.
Probably anything that Carrot Top was in.
But hey, how's your vacation going and what's going? I've been meaning to check on you.
I mean, I've been drinking a lot of coffee and writing about these movies, but honestly, I don't think that a lot of people have even heard about most of these movies. At least, I don't think anybody's really watched The $1 Million Duck.
I feel like $1 Million Duck is like a must-watch now, because if someone who's paid to watch movies can't sit through it, that's probably worth checking out.
I mean, there are some movies that I'm going to get into that I think people have seen, or at least heard of, like Bedknobs and Broomsticks.
Oh yeah, that time they tried to redo Mary Poppins, but not as good. Feels like a metaphor for the whole era.
Right, yeah. Another 1971 release is the Angela Lansbury-led Bedknobs and Broomsticks. It was actually in development since the early 1960s, until Mary Poppins became the more favorable film to make. It eventually did get picked up in the late 60s, and Mary Poppins star David Tomlinson was brought in to co-lead with Lansbury. And Lansbury had actually been cast only when Julie Andrews opted to turn down the lead role. The Sherman Brothers, who had written all of the songs for Mary Poppins, were also brought in to write the music for Bedknobs.
I missed a codfish!
Based around the idea of magic and magical people looking for a spell to help the British forces during World War II. This film is free to explore magical worlds and is the first hybrid animated live-action movie since Mary Poppins.
I remember watching Bedknobs and Broomsticks pretty often as a kid, but nothing from its plot ever stuck with me in the same ways that Mary Poppins or Who Framed Roger Rabbit did. It's an inventive film and technically great. In fact, it won an Academy Award for Best Special Effects, but nothing about its music or characters or story are actually as good as Mary Poppins, the film that it was trying to capitalize off of.
Funny enough, Angela Lansbury disliked Bedknobs and Broomsticks because her acting had to be so precise for the animation and other technical elements to work. It was at this point, after Bedknobs and Broomsticks, that I felt the need to pour myself a drink, as the task of continuing to write and research was more and more daunting. It isn't so much the quality of the films as much as it is the near pointless push of films out of the studio. It just feels like everyone was asking what would Walt do, but the answer to that was to just keep making movies like they had, not creating anything new or revolutionary. They cycled through the same actors and created films that either felt like movies they'd already made or were sequels like the next film, 1974's Herbie Rides Again. Trying to maximize 2 separate franchises, Disney made Herbie Rides Again with the Volkswagen Love Bug making its return, in an attempt to save a woman from corrupt business developer Alonzo Hawk, the villain from The Absent-Minded Professor. Combining 2 successful franchises together did work. Piggybacking off of the original Love Bug proved to be financially successful, but creatively dark. Disney continued the Love Bug series with Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo in 1977, Herbie Goes Bananas in 1980, and then again in 2005 with Lindsay Lohan's Herbie Fully Loaded. Pure genius on their part. I mean, the Love Bug even became a TV show for a while. Seriously, this company was keeping Volkswagen in business at this point.
And then Disney tried something new. Thank goodness for 1975's Escape to Witch Mountain.
Directed by John Howe, who had come off of directing mostly thrillers and horror films, Witch Mountain is a darker film that took a risk, and Howe is someone to keep in mind for later. We'll come back to him. Just plant that in the back of your brain. Escape to Witch Mountain is a story about 2 orphaned kids with powers being chased by a millionaire. This feels like an X-Men type of thriller film. For Disney, this was as far away from everything else that they were doing as you could possibly get, and it paid off, becoming one of their most successful films of the decade. Film critic Gene Siskel, who had walked out on The $1 Million Duck previously, called this film something special compared to anything that Disney had recently been putting out. It would get its own sequel, Return from Witch Mountain, in 1978, and it would also end up getting a made-for-TV film sequel in the 1980s called Beyond Witch Mountain. And then, of course, there's the reboot in the 2000s starring The Rock called Race to Witch Mountain. Honestly, Disney can't get enough of taking something successful and running with it until it's a complete shell of what it used to be. I'm not trying to be overly cynical, I swear I'm not. This was supposed to be a much more fun video. The darker tones were something that worked for Disney though, and planted the thought that darker material could become something that Disney created, rather than just light fluffy comedies and adventure films. This would work out in both good and very bad ways, something, again, we'll get to later. Then there's the Apple Dumpling Gang, starring Bill Bixby, the guy that's most famous for playing Dr. Banner in the Incredible Hulk show. You know, this show.
Oh my God, it's him!
Shoot him! Shoot him!
It's basically a slapstick comedy film set in a Western. Interestingly, the lead of the film isn't what most people remember from the Apple Dumpling Gang. It became one of the studio's biggest successes of the era, thanks to its pairing of longtime comedy stars Don Knotts and Tim Conway, best known for their roles on The Andy Griffith Show, McHale's Navy, The Carol Burnett Show, and Three's Company. Both comedians would end up becoming regulars at the studio, and they can be considered one of the great comedic duos of cinema, up there with Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, or Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder, or Lindsay Lohan and Lindsay Lohan in The Parent Trap.
Hey Josh, I feel like you're building towards some kind of Lindsay Lohan joke here.
Is a continued joke about Lindsay Lohan too weird?
I'm not sure if it's too weird, but she should probably drop it anyways. I heard Pitbull got sued for making jokes about her.
No. Mr. Worldwide has it all wrong. Okay, he doesn't know what a good joke is. This bit rules, Joe.
This bit does not rule, but if it makes you happy, carry on. And as long as the channel knows that this was not my idea and it's all you, we're good.
Following the Apple Dumpling Gang was another sequel, 1976's The Shaggy DA. But this one's worth discussing because it gave us one of the funniest scenes in cinema history.
Out of my way!
Featuring frequent Disney stars Dean Jones, Suzanne Plachette, Keenan Wynn, and Tim Conway, it plays on the idea of Wilby Daniels, once a teen dog, now a man-turned-dog, who worries about his ability to be elected as district attorney as a dog, and finds out that the current district attorney that he's running against is working with crime organizations. If all that sounds insane, just remember that this is a movie that features a dog punching a man with his dog arm.
Out of my way!
On a more serious note, this would be the last film directed by Robert Stevenson, one of the studio's most prolific directors.
Prior to working nearly exclusively with Disney, he had made Jane Eyre with Orson Welles, and a slew of other films dating back to 1928. At Disney, though, he had been in charge of some of the studio's most recognizable earlier live-action films, including Old Yeller, Mary Poppins, The Love Bug, The Absent-Minded Professor, and so many more. He also worked on Zorro for TV, as well as the Disneyland and Wonderful World of Color shows. His contributions to the company in terms of live-action filmmaking were unmatched in the early years, and he helped establish Disney not just as a great animation studio, but a great film and television studio. So it's only fitting that he got some kind of proper send-off, with the most epic man-dog punch in film history. Another 1976 film, now considered a classic, is Freaky Friday, featuring Barbara Harris and a young Jodie Foster, just coming off of her critically acclaimed role in Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver. Honestly, It's insane to me that she came from such a gritty and downright disturbing Scorsese film to the upbeat Disney comedy where she once again steals every scene that she's in. The story follows a mother and daughter magically swapping bodies for the day, taking their tumultuous relationship and finding a better understanding of each other by its end. It's also of interest that Jodie Foster, who had been in several other Disney films like Samantha and Napoleon and One Little Indian, films that I didn't really talk about because honestly, they're not of much importance.
But her contract with Freaky Friday actually kept her out of a very important film that she had auditioned for, Star Wars, where she was supposed to be a younger version of Princess Leia. So I guess with that you can say that Freaky Friday changed film history. And with that, it's been a long night, and I'm off to bed. See you later.
Did I dream of everything? Have I been here this whole time? Am I in my own dark age?
Hey, Josh, you're back. How was the cabin?
Joe, I was at the cabin, and then I poured myself some coffee. I started writing about all of this different stuff from the dark age. I went to bed, and then I woke up right here. Like a Freaky Friday situation, Joe.
Freaky Friday? Does that mean you woke up in someone else? Are you Jodie Foster now?
No, this is like the Lindsay Lohan Freaky Friday, Joe. I think that she's been listening in somehow and figuring out that we're making jokes about her. I got low hand, Joe.
I don't think that's a
low hand. And if you don't stop talking right now, she could low hand the entire channel.
What does that even mean?
Pete's Dragon is actually a personal favorite of mine from this film era, and it could just be because of how cute that Elliot is, or it might be because of my memories of seeing the Main Street Electrical Parade at Disneyland that featured Pete and Elliot. Walt Disney actually gained the film rights to Pete's Dragon in the 1950s and wanted Kevin Corcoran, one of the studio's child stars, to be a part of it. He's the one that's basically playing the little brother and everything. He was supposed to be Pete. Then Walt thought that instead of a movie, maybe it would be a multi-part series for the Disneyland TV show. But not really knowing what to do with it, it just ended up on the shelf until it got picked back up again in the late 60s to start production on a musical version. The music would become a key component of the film by its 1977 release, where it would be nominated for Best Musical Score and Best Song for Candle on the Water. Another significant factor for Pete's Dragon is that it's the first film with animation at Disney never touched by any of Walt's 9 old men, the animators that had worked on all of his films since 1938's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Instead, a much younger animation team took charge of Pete's Dragon, one of many films that would become contentious between the younger and older animation staff. But that's another story for the Animation Eras videos that I already made, so I'm not going to get into much detail about that. Similar to Bedknobs and Broomsticks, Pete's Dragon was a film that tried to live up to Mary Poppins, but didn't really succeed. It would get mixed reviews at best, and ultimately its lasting legacy is probably the Main Street Electrical Parade float that they decide to bring out every few years at Disneyland to boost ticket sales. It is a cool parade though. But then a turn of events starts to happen by the end of the 1970s. There's a few films like Candle Shoe with Jodie Foster or Hot Lead and Cold Feet with Don Knotts. And then there's The Cat from Outer Space, a return to the animal comedies where a lab scientist becomes friends with an alien that looks like a cat. You know, similar to the cat from Captain Marvel that is actually an alien that looks like a cat. Yeah. Anyways, the scientist decides to name this not cat Jake, you know, a totally normal, non-conspicuous name for a cat.
What's your name, huh? Charlie? Cuddles? Jake? Yes, you look like Jake.
because he needs to hide it from the government, who's trying to hunt it down because they want to study its alien body. It's weird, filled with the usual sight gags, and it failed Disney at the box office, like many of the other films from this era. It was at this time that filmmakers decided to take a hard look at what needed to change at the studio to keep it going. The theme parks were doing well, the animated movies were at least making money, but the live action department had more misses than hits on their hands, and they were just simply churning out movies just to churn out movies. So they decided to ditch all of the studio stars. They stopped making so many freaking sequels, and they got serious, making their first ever PG-rated film, 1979's The Black Hole. The most successful films of the 1970s, at least financially, were movies like Star Wars and The Exorcist, movies that we consider synonymous with the best of cinema now. So Disney looked to take on something more adult and serious in tone. Made on a $20 million budget and originally seen as 20,000 Leagues but in space, The Black Hole ditched the usual studio stars in favor of acclaimed film star Ernest Borgnine and Anthony Perkins, the man who made Norman Bates a household name in the movie Psycho. And then the film was rounded out with Academy and Golden Globe Award winners. The story sees the crew of a ship explore deep space and run into a long-lost ship with one leftover member who turns out to have lobotomized his fellow crew members and turned them all into robots. It's all a bit more sinister than any Disney film before, and Disney really did not know how to market this thing. Nabisco was hired to have robot pencil holders and cereal boxes. The Little Golden Books created a story about the robots showcasing their former ship. And a Disney read-along vinyl record was produced that actually provided a happy ending for the crew of the ship, something that is really not true to the film. It all seems really weird for a film that's such a tragedy. Toys and cereal boxes or illustrated kids' books for children learning to read just doesn't seem to fit. It would be like adding packages of dust to cereal boxes to market Avengers Infinity War.
I don't want to go. I don't want to go. Sir, please. Please, I don't want to go. I don't want to go.
It just doesn't connect, and I'm now realizing that I've kind of made this whole thing a bit darker, so we're just gonna move on. The film would end up being nominated for visual effects and cinematography at the Academy Awards, and it was a modest financial success. It didn't blow anyone away, and it ended up earning mixed reviews, but Disney must have seen the potential in this new direction enough to greenlight several other films, including 1980's The Watcher in the Woods. Okay, remember how I said that we were going to get back to John Howe? Well, it's now. We're here. Because he helped write the script for The Black Hole, and he was the director for The Watcher in the Woods, Disney's first real horror film. Disney once again turned to Academy and Golden Globe winning actors with Bette Davis and Carol Baker. It's basically a film about a girl that goes missing, and the original ending and opening scenes were either cut or changed in order to keep the film at a PG rating due to the horror of seeing the Watcher as a monster. Unfortunately, critics deemed it not scary enough to be a good horror movie for adults, and it was a bit too scary for a younger audience. Ultimately, Disney was successful in making a movie for no one. The Watcher in the Woods would lose money, as did several other early 80s films, including the drama Night Crossings, the fantasy film Dragon Slayer, and Something Wicked This Way Comes, a film about a demonic circus. Yeah, Disney had a difficult time with all of those goofy comedies, but nobody really wanted this dark, dramatic horror tone out of a company that was synonymous with family-friendly, all-ages entertainment.
Okay, but was there anything successful during this time? Even the parks? What about Disneyland Tokyo? Wasn't that good?
It might cure culture shock. But as puzzling as all this looks, it's really quite simple. The Japanese may not be...
Maybe. I mean, did you see those faces?
This film era makes me feel the way those people felt.
But good news, Joe, there are at least a couple of films left that we have to talk about that were at least sort of successful, and we'll leave it on a happy note with Popeye and Tron.
Light cycles, hell yeah.
Yeah, we'll get to talking about light cycles, but first we have to talk about Popeye, because it actually is a pretty significant film in the history of Disney's live-action filmmaking. The story plays out like you'd assume. Popeye, the hero, has to defeat the villain Bluto in order to save his love olive oil. The film features Robin Williams and Shelley Duvall, and despite negative critical reviews, Popeye was extremely successful financially, becoming one of the top-grossing films of 1980. More important is that Popeye was the first ever film that Disney collaborated with someone else on, working with Paramount Pictures to create the film and then becoming the foreign distribution arm for it. Working with Paramount Pictures actually had them in touch with executive Jeffrey Katzenberg and president of the studio, Michael Eisner.
Hello, I'm Michael Eisner, head of the Walt Disney Company.
Of course, we know that Eisner would soon leave Paramount to become the CEO of Disney, transforming the company and making it more successful than ever. But first, we have to talk about Tron. The last and probably biggest success of Disney's live-action dark age, Tron was a breakthrough in computer animation and special effects. Unable to render actual animation, 4 different computer companies were hired to create the film's special effects frame by frame, and then they took pictures of their computers in order to overlay it with the filmed footage. Despite Tron having to go up against a Directors Guild strike, getting an early release to go up against Don Bluth's The Secret of NIMH, and just the trials of trying to create something so technical, this film found its audience. Let me be clear, Tron wasn't originally super successful. It had to go up against the Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., and Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, which were all released in the summer months of 1982. But it grew a following very quickly, and it was also critically praised. Roger Ebert gave the film 4 out of 4 stars, calling it a dazzling Disney film, which seems like such praise that was rarely ever heard during this time. Disney was in a major flux during this entire period, and its live-action films reflect that. Early on, the films were stagnant, unsure how to overcome the passing of Walt Disney, and as executives continued to change at the studio, the films began to as well, due to the lack of visionary leadership. They morphed into something so not Disney that people rejected the films altogether. I'm not gonna lie to you, there were some times during this video that it was just a drag to get through, because a lot of these movies just aren't worth revisiting or even seeing for the first time. But that's gonna change soon, with the influx of Michael Eisner.
Hello, I'm Michael Eisner.
And Frank Wells as leaders at the studio. A new division in Touchstone Pictures would prove that there's space for more adult films, just not with the Disney logo attached, and that live-action films could once again be successful at the studio. See, I told you that we'd get back to talking about Touchstone.
So that's it. We're in the clear, no call from YouTube, we're good?
No call from YouTube, but I should probably figure out how I got Lohan back home, like Ebenezer Scrooge.
Nope, no Lohan, no more. What we should focus on, now that you mentioned Scrooge, is we do a holiday video around this time.
Right, we've done Home Alone and the Simpsons Christmas, we've done Prep and Landing, we even did the Muppets. Should we do like the Santa Claus next?
Not Tim Allen. Not this time. And he knows why. But we should do animation. Something, there's got to be some great Christmas specials.
You know what? There are a ton of great Christmas specials, Joe, and most of them are made by the exact same company. We'd be taking a bit of a detour away from Disney, but we'd get to talk about Rankin Bass.
Bass. A fish guy, eh?
Listen, that fish guy made Christmas magic.